Hi folks, welcome back. So if you're new to my channel and you come into this video from a slightly sort of broader audience, because these videos tend to pick up people that aren't necessarily invested in landscape photography, I'm Stuart McGlennon. I'm a professional landscape photographer and gallery owner for the past 8 years. And when I'm making a video about selling prints like this, I'm trying to come to it from the perspective of someone who is living and breathing the process of selling prints for a living, as this gallery makes up probably 70% of my total revenue across the year. You'll see a lot of well-meaning advice from people on social media, places like YouTube and Instagram, around selling prints, and often it's coming from people that, as I say, often well-meaning, and some of it is valid. You'll often find those people have not got any demonstrable evidence of selling prints in any great scale or consistency. So it's important to understand where the advice is coming from around this topic, because there's some things in this video that I'm going to discuss which you probably won't come across on many other videos, and that's understandable because they're not coming to it from the same perspective as I am. But let's get into it first off the bat. Now, it's important to get across to people that it's okay to not sell prints. 99.9% of photographers out there will never sell prints in any great volume or consistency, and that's okay. There's many things that I'm going to discuss in this video that are going to be in your way as barriers to selling prints, which ultimately you'll never really be able to fight against or do anything about. I don't want that to sound hopeless, but at the same time, it would be wrong of me as someone in my position to be painting a false narrative around selling prints. So yeah, buckle up folks. Okay, so we've got one of the big ones out of the way first, which is we're comfortable we're never really going to sell prints, and that's okay. This video isn't going to be about how to sell prints. It's more going to give you a reality check as to why you're probably not selling prints. But one of the big barriers is the phone screen, or more broadly, any kind of computer screen, whether it's a tablet or a desktop or whatever. When you're selling art, there's a reason art galleries will always be king in terms of selling this stuff, because when you're buying art, it's an inherently physical experience. We've all stood in amazing galleries with some amazing artwork in front of us, and you're able to build that connection with the thing in front of you. You're able to take in the scale of the piece, the texture on the paper, the craftsmanship in the framing, all those little intangible things, the scale of the piece and how it might look in your home. You're able to connect with it in a way that you're just not able to do with a phone screen. Now, this is a real issue because you can have the best images in the world and you can have the most curated, wonderful website and all those things. But ultimately, from the feedback I get from people in my gallery, is that they would almost never buy something off the strength of looking at it on a phone screen. Unless they're really invested on a personal level with your photography, it's going to be a very tough ask to get them to spend a lot of money on something just off a screen. All those intangible elements that I was talking about there, it's very difficult to build that when you're sat behind a desk looking at something. The line I'll always give to people, and I think I mentioned it in the last video I did on this subject 5 years ago now, actually, that video, but the analogy I'll always use, and it's the most simple one I can give, is that for most sane people, you would never buy a sofa without sitting on it. And it's kind of the same thing with photography, or really art in general, is that you need to be in front of it, living and experiencing it, before you'll consider buying it and putting it on your wall. Okay, so pricing. This is an important factor. And as I say, I'm not trying to tell you how to sell prints. I'm telling you how pricing feeds into the issue of selling prints. If you see me looking at my notes here, I'm just keeping an eye on them to keep me on track, because I do a lot of this stuff off the top of my head and I don't want to ramble on too much. But pricing, it's an important one, because for most photographers, it's priced too low in terms of prints. And what that does is it leads to a little bit of distrust from the buyer's side, because we've all been there. It doesn't matter whether it's photography or not. If you see something that is cheap, you do start to question immediately, why is it cheap? And is this thing that I'm buying that is cheap, is it replaceable? Is it a commodity? Can I go and get it elsewhere for a better price, etc., etc.? And it all feeds in to the kind of narrative and perspective of photography is of less value, and you can get it everywhere, and it trains people who buy this stuff to expect the prices to be low and to expect things like discounts and whatnot. It drives the overall value of photography down. And for the photographer, it's understandable, because you're in that desperate fight to try and sell these prints. So the kind of understandable thing is to price at a point where you can undercut people and you can maybe grab those sales. But for the wider kind of landscape of photography in terms of pricing, it's a net negative, because everyone starts doing that and it drives the whole thing down, and photography ends up being seen as a commodity. So it's a tricky one, because it's perfectly understandable, as I say, why photographers will price like that. But the one message I would give to photographers, if you're thinking about selling your prints, first off, don't price too low, because it's a position that you'll struggle to get away from. If you price down here and then all of a sudden in the future you think, hey, my work's really worth something here, and you suddenly, up your prices, for people who follow your work, they're then going to think, well, hang on a sec, why is he doubled or tripled his prices? You need to think about that to start with, because overall, you're never going to sell these things in any great volume. So you may as well price your work at what you think is fair and values your time and skill correctly. Don't price down here. Very difficult to get out of that space. Okay, so this next one, it leads on a little bit from the pricing element, but it's important to also consider the wider kind of macroeconomics of what's going on in the world today. Now, I can only really come to this from a UK perspective, but I think it's fair to say across Western economies in a broad sense, in that everyone is struggling a little bit. Certainly here in the UK, disposable household income is falling all the time. And things like artwork, luxury items, stuff like that, frivolous spending, if you like, most people are starting to cut back on a lot of that. And if you're thinking of trying to scale up your print business and trying to sell these things at scale, right now is probably the worst time to do it, because people are really cutting back their spending on really only essential things. So tough times at the minute in terms of the economy in general, and photography is particularly vulnerable, because when people are thinking of buying the odd luxury item here and there, especially things like stuff to go in the house like decor, photography, because it's kind of seen as a bit of a lesser art form, which I'll discuss a bit further in this video, but because it's kind of seen as a bit of a lesser art form, it does get lumped in with other decor type pieces for home furnishings, and people will prioritize other cheaper items other than photography. So at the minute, the economy is not good here in the UK, and selling prints right now is a pretty tough thing to do. All right, so we've talked a little bit about some of the more kind of surface level issues around selling prints there, but let's get into a bit more of the nitty gritty and some of the more, philosophical reasons as to why you might not be selling prints. One of the key things is artistic growth, because I've definitely experienced this to a lesser extent in my own gallery, but it's something that I've also witnessed in the photography community, is that if you're a photographer who has prioritized selling prints, then there's a good chance that you will have had to compromise somewhere along the line your artistic growth. there's definitely a perception in the photography community that if you're one of those people who wants to really sell prints at volume, you're almost not taken seriously. Now, I don't really have that issue in here because I actually have a physical gallery space, but I have seen photographers in the past who have prioritized this, and other photographers have kind of looked down their nose at them a little bit because they've wanted to really make some money out of selling prints. But that approach often leads to a lack of artistic growth because the photographer is forced to produce images that are probably a bit formulaic. They're quite safe images that they know that they'll sell, and often they're trying to produce consistent imagery that appeals to quite a broad audience, and that really doesn't lead to artistic growth. It doesn't allow the photographer a lot of wiggle room to experiment on different things, because what we often like as photographers, and I've discussed this in previous videos, what we like often does not appeal to a broad audience. So if you're trying to, as I say, really sort of focus on the print sales side of things, there's a good chance that you're going to have to make some artistic compromises, which a lot of people aren't willing to do, which is absolutely correct. So it does feed into the kind of broader idea that, you know, that a lot of these issues around selling prints aren't necessarily in your control. You know, often, and this is a key thing to consider, is that often the most successful print sellers are photographers you've never heard of. Okay, so let me give you some real world examples of what I'm talking about here between artistic merit and kind of mass selling of prints. These two images, if you were to look at them from an artistic perspective, and certainly from a photographer who's been around the block a long time now and knows what a good image is, these two images, if you were to talk to people in the photography community, they would say these are really good images. The first one, the door to Narnia, this was commended in International Landscape Photography of the Year. It was in the top 101, I believe. One of my all-time favourite images, and one that I took on this channel. The second image, The Shelter, this was commended in UK Landscape Photography of the Year. So both have won, you know, fairly major awards, but as far as selling them goes to a broader audience, they're a really tough sell, because when people come in this gallery and they look at them, they don't relate to them at all. They think that I've photoshopped them in some way, and there's already straight off the bat, there's an element of distrust with them. But it really shows the point about artistic growth versus mass selling of print. If I was to fill my whole gallery with images like this, it would be a really tough business to run, because I'd be happy looking at them, and they have a lot of artistic merit within the photography community. But as far as broad appeal goes in terms of selling them, really tough sell. And it's why I don't stock an awful lot of these images in the gallery, and they don't occupy a lot of wall space, is because they just do not broadly appeal. And it's something that you do have to factor in if you're trying to sell prints at any kind of scale, is how they appeal to a broader audience. Okay, so I think it's important to discuss, in my opinion, the most important point here, which is landscape photography, and just photography in general, is and always has suffered from an identity crisis. It has bad PR, if you like, and the perception of landscape photography and photography in general to a broad audience is that it is of low value. And I mentioned some of this earlier on, but I'll give you a real world example here in this gallery. So I get hundreds and hundreds of people coming through this gallery every year. And this is something that you see often during the school summer holidays, where families will come in with kids, usually kids of a young age, say let's say between under 10s. And what will often happen is the parents and the children will be discussing what they're looking at, and the kids will say to the parents, oh, these are lovely paintings. And the parent will correct the child and say, no, these are pictures. And what often happens is there's a look of kind of disappointment on the child's face that these are pictures, they're not paintings. And you can see how that attitude kind of unconsciously sort of permeates over time. And it's no wonder that when people get to adulthood that they grow up with this idea that photography is of lesser value than paintings. Now, I don't want this to become a video about the perceived value of photography and all that. That's a kind of broader discussion. But what I'm saying is that from stuff I witness every day in here is that photography is not perceived very well. It's not held in high regard. And that's something that I think a lot of photographers struggle to understand sometimes, is because they're not living the reality of seeing how it's perceived with a broader audience outside of photography. We do, certainly in landscape photography anyway, look at this stuff in a little bit of a vacuum, I think, and not understand wider perceptions and attitudes to photography. But I'll give you another real world example here. This is a little bit of digging that I've done, and it does paint a pretty accurate picture of what I'm talking about there. So if you look at the period between 2005 and 2024, across all sales of photography, the figure is 3.7 billion, which sounds like a big number, and it is obviously. But when you compare that for the same time period across paintings sold, the number is enormous, nearly 150 billion. That's a massive disparity there. And it tells you kind of all you need to know about how people perceive photography and its value. Now, what you also see, and again, I know this firsthand from talking to other curators of galleries in the town where I operate, is that galleries themselves, I was talking earlier about how galleries are always the best place to display photography, but galleries themselves are very reluctant to showcase photography in any great volume for some of these reasons that I'm talking about, general perception. Galleries also see photography as less valuable. And when you're running a business, you're obviously going to want to stock things that you know are going to sell. And photography, when you compare it with paintings and other types of art, it's less of a sure thing. So curators in galleries often end up having to price photography work at a lower price than the photographer will probably like to. And from the photographer's perspective, the photographer then has to factor in, obviously, the input costs of producing the artwork, so printing it, framing it, all that sort of thing. By the time you do that and then take off the gallery commission, which is usually, can be anything up to 70%. I mean, a lot of galleries broadly are about 60%, but some are higher. If you take off the commission and the input costs, it doesn't leave the photographer with a huge amount of money. And there's not many photographers that are of the status and their work is of sufficient quality where they can sell their work at a really high price in a gallery and consistently sell. There are a few, but there aren't many. And that's where I think, to be honest, the kind of cold reality for you watching this is that there's a good chance your photography just isn't of a high enough standard or unique enough to command those sort of prices where selling in a gallery is going to be worthwhile. And that's even if the gallery will even take you on in the first place. So I don't want that to sound overly negative, but from the gallery's perspective as well, not just the kind of broader audience perspective, but galleries are very reluctant to stock photography in general because of the wider perception that it has. Okay, so I understand that this video has probably been somewhat negative in terms of selling prints and all that sort of stuff, but it is the reality. It's not an outwardly positive reality for photographers trying to sell this stuff, but I think it's important to maybe reframe this discussion and turn it more towards the value of printing for you as a photographer personally, not necessarily from a commercial standpoint, because it's okay for you as a photographer not to sell lots of prints. Not everything has to be monetized. We live in a world now where people pick up hobbies and they're kind of instructed from all kinds of different angles, from influencers and whatnot, as to how you can sell this stuff, how you can monetize. Well, don't think like that, because you have to consider your worth in all this. If you go down the road of what I was talking about before, where pricing your work low leads to kind of undervaluing the artistic process that you go through to produce those images, it's not a good place to be. It's not a fair reflection of your skill as a photographer and your creativity. So if you are going to sell those images, as I said earlier, don't price them too low. But I think it's important to stress that these truths about the market for selling print is not a direct measure of your worth as a photographer. It's not always a measure of your quality and your creativity as a photographer. I think that's really important to keep in mind, that for the most part, these issues that I've discussed here are outside of your control as a photographer, and they're not things that ultimately you're going to really be able to change. But when you understand all this, you can then start to change the narrative. You can decide how prints work into your photography rather than the other way around. Don't get sucked into doing your photography and then immediately jumping into, I must sell prints. Let it come to you. If it's something that you want to get involved in, make sure that you price fairly for your time and your skill, but also try not to focus on scaling and mass producing this stuff, because for me, I don't think it's a good road to go down. I'm in a pretty unique position in this gallery in that it's a very different way of selling prints to the 99% of photographers. In a gallery, I have all those advantages. Without this gallery, selling prints would be an extremely difficult task for me, as it would for any other photographer. But I don't want this video, as I said, to come across kind of overly negative, but I do think it's important to get across some of these realities, because I think if you watch some content out there, it leads photographers to believe that if you just follow these 10 steps, you'll suddenly start selling prints, which, to be honest, I think for the most part is a load of nonsense. But anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I've tried to kind of frame it as best I can. I do appreciate it was somewhat, well, I don't want to say negative, because, as I say, I think it's important to kind of give a truthful perspective on what I see with selling prints, and hopefully I've done that in this video anyway. But I've got a lot of photography coming up after Christmas. I'm in Harris for a fortnight doing workshops, so on the spare days when I'm not teaching, I'll be filming a little bit up there. So lots more to come on the channel. You'll have noticed I've been putting out some fairly regular content on here, and I'm going to try and keep that momentum going into the new year. But have a great Christmas, everyone, and I'll see you on the next one.